Hello everybody and welcome to the first class of content. Today we're going to focus on this idea of native space that came out of the readings. Now, before I get into all of that material, I have a couple exercises I want to do that I think are really useful. The first one is I would ask students to raise their hands. You can just do this individually on your own, right? How many people have heard that there were genocides against Native American peoples? When I do this, class raises their hands, right? Everybody knows this. Everybody knows that there was a genocide. Now, what do you know about that genocide? What do you know about that history? Now, when I've taught this class and take a moment, pause the recording if you need to, and just think, write down on a scrap piece of paper, what do you know about that genocide? Now, when I have offered this course, when I've done this course in the past, I used to teach on the East Coast, right? In Massachusetts, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia. And when I do this exercise on the East Coast, I actually am getting different answers than when I've done this at Cabrillo College with students in person. Because on the East Coast, what I find every single time, and I've been doing this for about 10 years now almost, is that students know next to nothing about the genocide. And I always then ask them to reflect, what does that mean? That we all know that there was a genocide, however, we don't know anything about that history. What does that tell you? And I think that's worth thinking about for y'all as well. Now, I will say that what seems to be different in California is that there has been a major push in recent years to teach students in high school and younger about the history of colonization and indigenous peoples. This has been a deliberate push in the school systems to correct those past wrongs that we still see on the East Coast. However, in practice, what I have learned is that it is often quite complicated and messy. Yes, students learn about the history of colonization and the violence and the genocide of what happened. They learn a lot of that material. But they don't necessarily do so in a way that prioritizes actual Native American people's perspectives. And in particular, Native American students often express to me that even while they were learning that material in school, their teachers were not open to hearing when they would share, for example, traditional knowledge shared with them from their family members or perspectives from that community, because that was considered outside the content of the lesson plan. And so even though there's this funny contradiction in California that I'm starting to notice, right? Even though there's this effort to understand that history of genocide, of colonization, and correct past wrongs in our schooling system, that is not actually translating into better outcomes all the time for Indigenous students, or at least it's not translating into space for Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing. Instead, what we end up with is what I deduce. Again, this is a deduction from my part. I'm certainly not an expert on California curriculum and its impact on Indigenous students. But what I'm starting to notice as a social scientist is that Indigenous peoples in this area continue to feel silenced, and to cover this material continues to center a settler perspective. Settler meaning non-native in this context. We'll get into that a little more in the upcoming classes. And so take a moment to just think about that. How is it that we are trying settlers, in this example, non-native folks, are trying so hard to correct historical wrongs, but the actual activity does not hold space for Indigenous students in the way that Indigenous students really want and need. So go ahead and this is going to be the first forum discussion. So there is going to be an attachment for this module in which you will have several discussion forums to participate with your classmates. And the first thing I want y'all to do here is say, hey, where are you from? And where did you go to school? What did you learn about colonization? And the genocide against indigenous peoples in that school, right? So the idea with these first two parts is you're telling each other what you learned about this history, but you're also contextualizing that because you're going to find that different people in different places learn different things, and tell your peers, what kind of school did you go to, right? Like, how does that impact the curriculum? Give them that additional context so we can start mapping, in these places students are learning this material, it's done this way over here, and over there it's done this other way. For example, I'll give you a very different perspective from Georgia, where I went to high school. In Georgia, the total amount of the history of this material that I learned was that indigenous peoples, it comes from the first chapter of my American history textbook. It was like maybe the first quarter of the first chapter talked about indigenous peoples. And then indigenous peoples never came up the rest of the year, right? It creates this impression almost like Native American folks sort of disappear and are unimportant in indigenous history after that initial moment. And, ultimately the idea was that indigenous folks adopted one of four models. I don't remember all four of the models of responses to settler colonialism. And they had different historical figures that kind of represented that response. So one was avoiding, right, moving further west to areas that were not controlled settler colonies, just moving away. Now this is different than the Trail of Tears, which was a death march, and also part of larger U.S. policies of what's called Indian removal, which is a series of laws passed, which was a law passed in 1830 and authorized these death marches, right? But in addition to the death marches, many indigenous peoples choose to move further away. It was militant armed resistance, and another was assimilation. And that was it, right? I've just taught you everything I knew about that history of genocide that I learned in high school. Right? That's very little, right? Like, we're going to do a whole class on this material. We're going to do a whole class on just 1700 to 1900. And we're going to have to leave out so much even to accomplish that. Right? So kind of using that as a model, right? Using my example as a model, where did you go to school? What was that context? I also should have said I went to a private school. My mom was a teacher. I was on scholarship. This was the best, most liberal, lefty education that Georgia had to offer. This was not what public school kids were doing. So, where are you from? Give us that context. What did you learn about colonization and genocide in school? And then, what do you wish you had learned differently? What do you wish had been done differently? And if you feel comfortable if you're an indigenous person and you feel comfortable talking about this, no pressure, because, you don't need to be a representative for your people, let alone all Native American peoples ever. But if it's something that you want to talk about, what was that experience like for you? So what is Native American and Indigenous Studies anyway? Now, this is Indigenous Studies has many names. Critical Indigenous Studies, Native American and Indigenous Studies, American Indian Studies, different institutions, different colleges call it different things. But what it shares is it is an interdisciplinary field of study, meaning, right, like, just like you take classes in English, in social sciences, like political science, sociology, biology, etc., Native American and Indigenous Studies, it draws from all different fields. It's interdisciplinary, right? Moving between disciplines. Because the idea is that we have a shared set of issues, right? Which is understanding indigenous peoples and settler colonialism. And that all of those different fields of study can play a role, we can draw on them to help us understand this problem better. So Indigenous Studies, I like to think of it as a problem-focused discipline. It's trying to understand the problem of settler colonialism and indigenous self-determination and sovereignty, or liberation, however you want to frame it. It's interdisciplinary. We're drawing on many different fields. And it grows out of 1960s social movements. Student activists fought and were physically harmed by police to create indigenous studies and ethnic studies more broadly. It's something that students fought for and won in the 1960s. And so there is a kind of commitment in indigenous studies, right? How do we make knowledge, not just knowledge for its own sake, but knowledge, how do we do knowledge? How do we use the resources of colleges? How do we use these ways of understanding the world, these very powerful ways of understanding the world, in service of Indigenous peoples' projects? Okay, so I'm going to start with Lisa Brooks on native space. Lisa Brooks is an Abenaki professor at Amherst College. Abenaki, so we're looking in like the New England area. And she does this interview with J. Kealani Kawanui. Kealani is a Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian person. And they did this interview based on Lisa Brooks's book called The Common Pot, which is this really awesome book. I might give y'all a chapter this semester, we'll find out, in which she looks at how Native American peoples in New England used writing as a tool for their own ends, right? So taking writing as a technology of European settler colonial societies, right? That, for example, was often used in tricky ways. For example, there's a long history of doing things like signing treaties with indigenous peoples, but then but the treaty would be in English and the translation into the indigenous language would be, they'd leave out key details. So then the treaty, thinking it said one thing, and they'd end up signing something else. And now that's a legal document. So in this, writing was often used as a tool of violence and dispossession. But Lisa Brooks is saying also indigenous thinkers used it for their own ends. Now, of course, so that means, there's a big historical record of indigenous authors. However, the problem is not a lot of people have studied that record. There isn't a lot of people writing about those indigenous authors. One reason is because sometimes those indigenous authors were writing in their own languages, which most historians today cannot read, which means systematically leave out indigenous people's writings in favor of European perspectives. If for no other reason, there's many factors, but if for no other reason, because most historians can't read native languages. And again, we see Lisa Brooks asking this question: how can we make this useful to our communities? This is what Native American Studies does, right? It says, how do we make colleges and learning and scientific research, how do we make that useful to indigenous communities? Lisa Brooks says, hey, indigenous thinkers in the 1900s were they were asking the exact same question. And she tells you this really lovely story about her experience going to grad school, right? And finding out, hey, all of these stories, all of these perspectives that she knew about, right? That her family had taught, she learned from her family, right? About this history of indigenous philosophy. She found that when she got to university or college, that information just didn't seem to be there, right? And the way that her family had always told the story, the story that she was familiar with, just wasn't there. She says, when I was learning the history of New England, our struggles were the main story, right? It was shocking to me that none of it was there. She also has this lovely little side note, this mention from her dad, right? Who says the reason why American history starts with the Pilgrim and then immediately skips over to the Revolution is because in those 150 years in between, Native American peoples had the upper hand. Europeans did not have a solid grasp on power. They were not the only or primary power there. Indigenous peoples, indigenous nations were the primary power on the North American continent for most of this history. And Europeans often had to do their diplomacy, their interactions with native nations, on native people's cultural terms. Now, I want to do an exercise, right, as we start taking up what Lisa Brooks asks us to do, which is reimagine native space. What would it be like to look at this place and reimagine it as native space? To reorient how we interact with the landscape as a native place. So here's the exercise. This is something that I took from another professor, and I really like this exercise. On a piece of paper, draw a map of the United States at the time of the American Revolution. Pause the video, draw your map. It doesn't have to be beautiful. Just draw the map. What does the United States look like at the time of the American Revolution? And then, once you've done that, you can resume the video, and we'll pick up from there. And here is what the United States actually looked like at this time. And I will say even this map here is a little speculative. I'll explain that in a minute. But the first thing that, of course, I don't know what you drew, but with most students, they tend to draw the United States the way it looks now, right? Because we have this assumption built into us from the way we were raised that the United States is the way it is, and that's normal and natural, and that it's always been this way, and that it always will be this way. And what I really like about this exercise is it reminds us that the world was quite different at this point in time, and it also helps us identify our underlying assumptions of this idea of manifest destiny. This is an idea that came out of thinkers in the United States, settler, non-native thinkers, white people, who believed that the United States had a destiny given by God to expand from one coast to the other, and also north and south down to through what's now Canada and Mexico, Central America, South America. And this ideology of manifest destiny has become so entrenched in our lives that we forget that at this point in time the world looked really different. Now, I mentioned before that this map itself was already a little speculative. What I mean by that is that the United States did not really control all this territory that they have marked in this map as belonging to them. The further west you go, this is territory that was controlled by indigenous peoples, not the United States, not the British colonies before that. And so the way the map extends all of these colonies, all of these states, westward to the Mississippi River is actually not a realistic representation of the territory that the United States effectively was able to control. So here we see that maps are not neutral, they're not value objective. This map is actually being used to make a claim for the United States. They want to control that territory, and they are claiming that territory. But the map itself is an action of trying to accomplish that. But just because this is how the United States wants to see itself on a kind of official level, doesn't mean, that doesn't reflect the reality on the ground of what people are actually experiencing in these areas. And this is really getting at what Lisa Brooks wants us to do here, right? How do we challenge those pretensions and these mistaken ideas about space and land and maps in order to understand indigenous articulations of place, of space? What does this space look like from indigenous perspectives historically? And she says, using this phrase native space, it's a way for her to talk about this place before it was called New England. And also how this place continues to be native space even after New England is imposed upon it. We often assume that New England, or in the previous exercise, that the United States was always there, that it was inevitable, that it's natural and permanent, that this is how things always will be. And that is just not true. And by looking at the land as what Lisa Brooks calls native space, we can start to unlearn those assumptions. We can start to see, oh, no, it doesn't have to be this way. And it never had to. So the first thing Lisa Brooks does is she has to find maps that don't have that don't have state and national borders on them, right? Because most maps, they're going to focus on, hey, here's the line between between Canada and the United States, or United States and Mexico. Here's the line between New York and, New Jersey, or California and Arizona. Right? There's all those lines on it. And what she says first is okay, those lines have nothing to do with indigenous people's perspectives on this landscape, right? That's the settler colonial perspective. And this is really how settler nations operate. And more broadly, this is how nation states operate more broadly, which is by creating invisible lines that they mark on maps that say, hey, this is my territory, this is your territory, this is the United States, this is Canada. Now, because these are completely imaginary lines, the way to make them real is by violence primarily, right? Look at the southern border, right? You need to put people and technology and things like that on this invisible line. You build walls or shit, right? In order to basically say, hey, if you want to move across this line, you have to go through our border patrol. Now, this is really complicated for a lot of indigenous peoples because a lot of these borders were put right over their land, and they separated people from their own families. Near the southern border, for example, you have the Tohono Nation. The border between the U.S. and Mexico was put right between that community. So now, sometimes people have to cross this international border to even just get to their farmlands from their village. Same thing with the U.S. and Canada. Native peoples were always moving across these spaces. And so first, Lisa Brooks has to find maps that don't have those state and national lines on them. And then she starts putting different on the map. But unlike those maps that emphasized borders, her maps don't. They're just names that kind of float over various areas. Because there weren't formed boundaries. That's not how indigenous nationhood really worked. The way indigenous nationhood worked was more about things like, hey, what are you related to? Lands are you using to feed yourself or to hunt or to visit important spiritual places, sites? What matters in indigenous nationhood is not the border that separates one nation from another. It's not the line that separates nations. It's the lines that connects me to you. It's the line you travel to get from your people to another people. It's the trade route. It's the river that you take your canoe on. It's the path that you take to visit, to go marry into someone from another community and to go back to visit your family. In this part of the world, in New England, that would have been men primarily making that path because indigenous societies at this point in time largely, husbands were outsiders. They moved into the wife's community because the wife was really the person who is seen as like the mother is the person who gives you your identity from, your sense of your clan identity, your national identity. We'll keep coming back to that point. Anywho, part of the piece here, right, we can think about this from a legal perspective. What is the significance of those borders between nations and states versus Lisa Brooks's approach to mapping indigenous territory? We can often think about this as a distinction between property rights on the one hand and usufruct rights. You don't need to memorize these terms, right? And even the idea of usufruct, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right exactly, but anyway, even that concept, right, is still derived from Eurocentric political philosophy, not indigenous philosophy, but a lot of indigenous scholars use it because it does a good job of translating indigenous understandings of land property into a European legal language. So property right, look at, for example, land. Again, we're looking at the dispossession of territories. So let's say I own land. I have a house on it, and my land extends to the edge of the property border. Now, what does it mean for that land to be private property? What it means is that I have a piece of paper, I have a legal document that says that land belongs to me. Those boundaries, those imaginary lines that separate me from you. We see this really clearly. Usufruct rights. Let me go to that one first. Usufruct rights are a little different because the idea is that your rights to territory or land come not from a piece of paper, but come from your relationships, your use of that land, what you're actually doing with it. So it's, it might be a hunting territory, as I said before, or a fishing territory, or it might be something else, a sacred site, right? But the idea is that what matters less is that piece of paper of private property and more use rights. You have rights to it because you are using it. That'll come back when we talk about some of the early treaties because that was a really big piece of how indigenous diplomats saw their work. Now, a really good example of this distinction between these two kinds of rights is going to be rent. In a private property system, you pay rent to your landlord because they own the property. They have the piece of paper that says the property is theirs, not yours, even though you're the one using it. If you were to say, stop paying rent, they would be able to exercise coercive force to force you to. Basically, they'd go to the police. They'd file an eviction. They'd kick you out. And so you have to have this entire legal apparatus of a government to enforce that piece of paper. Whereas if we were to look at use rights, your house belongs to you because you're the one living there. Your landlord isn't using it, so it's not theirs. What claim do they have to it?